Welcome back. How long have you been watching my channel? Let me know below.
You ever watch your parents raise a glass to your sibling while you're standing right there, holding a tray of brownies you baked from scratch? Not because anyone asked you to, but because that's what you always do. Show up, fill in the gaps, smooth over the awkward moments, and make things easier for everyone else. That was me last Saturday. It was one of those big summer family BBQs, the kind where the smell of grilled ribs and gasoline from the portable generator mix with suntan lotion and citronella candles, where distant cousins show up in cargo shorts and flip-flops pretending they remember your name, where the kids are screaming over who gets the first slice of watermelon and the uncles are already 4 beers in by 3 p.m. My mom, Janet, was in hostess mode. Linen dress, matching earrings, arms folded tight like a general on the battlefield. Dad, Ron, was lounging in the shade with a toothpick in his mouth, pretending not to hear when Mom barked orders at him about the cooler or the folding chairs. I spent the morning helping set everything up, ran to the store when they forgot the ice, topped off the potato salad with extra paprika like I knew my dad liked it. I even cleaned the patio chairs with a bleach spray because someone mentioned they looked a little moldy last time. I wasn't planning to stay long, just enough to make an appearance, smile, hand out dessert, and sneak out before the second round of gin and tonics made everyone weirdly political. But then the moment happened. The one that made my whole body feel like it was vibrating, like I just stepped into an elevator shaft that had no floor. It was around 6 p.m. Sun was still up, cicadas screaming in the background. My Uncle Bill telling one of his same recycled stories about the Navy. Everyone gathered around the big oak table Mom had covered in one of her floral vinyl cloths. She clinked a fork against her wine glass and raised it high. Dad stood beside her, one hand on her shoulder, like a scene from a Norman Rockwell painting. And then she said it, with that rehearsed smile that told me she'd been waiting all day to say it out loud in front of a full audience. "We just want to take a moment," she began, her voice quivering with that forced sincerity she saves for public performances, "to raise a glass to our daughter Lily, the child who made us proud." There was a pause, a long one, long enough for someone to interject to say, "What about Claire?" But no one did. Not even Lily, who looked down at her feet and blushed like she didn't want the attention but was eating up every second of it. And I stood there next to the folding table, holding a tray of fudge brownies I'd baked the night before, using my grandmother's old recipe, the one I'd found in the back of her cookbook after she passed. I didn't say anything. I didn't flinch or make a face. I just smiled, the way you do when someone forgets your birthday or your name, or that you even exist. I handed the tray to Aunt Marie, nodded when she said, "These look delicious, Claire," and went back inside to refill the pitcher of lemonade. But something cracked wide open in me, right there between the paper plates and the sound of people clapping for Lily, like she'd just solved world hunger. It wasn't just the toast, it was the years. The accumulation of being the background daughter, the reliable one, the one who didn't need cheering on because she'd already taught herself how to clap alone in the dark. That night, after everyone had gone home and I was scrubbing barbecue sauce off the casserole dish Mom never thanked me for bringing, my phone buzzed with a message from Lily. Short, strange, no emojis, just, "Did you do something? Mom's a wreck." I stared at the screen like it was a trick. I hadn't said a word, I hadn't caused a scene, I hadn't done anything except exactly what I always do. Stay quiet, clean up, and leave. But here's the thing, something did happen that night, something real, something irreversible. Not loud, not obvious, but deep. Like a plate falling in slow motion that doesn't shatter right away. Just hits the floor and wobbles and spins, and you just know, it'll never be the same again. And I wasn't ready to talk about it yet. Not to Lily, not to Mom. But I'll tell you here. Because what they didn't know, what none of them saw coming, was that in my silence I'd already decided what I was going to do. And when I was finished, they wouldn't raise a glass again without wondering if it might turn to poison in their mouths. And now, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a moment like that, where you suddenly realized you were invisible to the very people who raised you? What would you have done? Would you have said something, thrown a drink, stormed out? Or would you have waited, watched, and planned something better, something colder? I didn't know it that night, but I had already started disappearing, quietly, carefully, and soon I would make sure they all felt the weight of that silence, every single one of them. The days after the barbecue passed in a kind of suspended haze, not quite heavy enough to be called grief, but far from the kind of emotional lightness one might expect after a family gathering. And while my phone remained mostly silent except for the usual work notifications and some coupon emails, I found myself playing that moment from the toast over and over in my head, each time wondering how no one had thought it was strange to exclude me from a gesture that was supposedly about familial pride. Not a single sideways glance, not one whispered. That was a little harsh, not even from Lily, who, to be fair, had always been more passive than cruel, more self-centered than outright malicious. But still, there she stood, accepting applause for being the child who made us proud. While I hovered in the margins like a damn catering staff member, no one tipped. You see, when you grow up being the responsible one, the one who doesn't stir drama, the one who people trust to lock the house, carry the extra keys, or remember everyone's birthday, even though no one remembers yours, people start to treat you less like a person and more like a piece of furniture that moves itself into place and never complains about the weight it carries. And it didn't start last weekend. Hell no. It started decades ago, in small, sharp moments that didn't seem important until they all added up like pennies in a jar you never meant to fill. I remember the first time I realized things were off. I must have been around 12. I had just won first place at the regional science fair. Not state, sure, but it was still a big deal to me. I had built a functioning model of a hydroponic greenhouse using recycled materials and was invited to present it at a university's open day, which I thought was about the coolest thing that had ever happened to me. I came home beaming, holding that blue ribbon like it was gold, and my mom, without even looking up from her phone, said, "That's nice, honey, but don't forget Lily has her ballet showcase on Saturday, and she needs help with her costume." That moment, that exact sentence, was the first time I remember the shape of resentment settling deep in my chest. Not because she didn't care about my ribbon, but because it didn't even register long enough to interrupt her thoughts about Lily. It became a pattern. I got my first job at 16, worked after school to help pay for college because I knew there was no trust fund waiting for me, while Lily was sent to SAT prep classes and Europe for a graduation trip. I applied for scholarships and bought my own car, a used Corolla with dents in the side, while Lily got surprised with a brand new CRV for her birthday and didn't even pretend to be shocked. When I got promoted at work and called to tell my parents, my mom's first response was, "That's good. Did you hear Lily got invited to speak at a conference in Chicago?" There was never malice in her voice, just this persistent undercurrent of redirection, like no matter what I did, it would always be the opening act for Lily's main performance. Even birthdays were unequal battlegrounds. I turned 30 with a modest dinner at Olive Garden, my treat by the way, while Lily's 31st was a surprise weekend in Napa, complete with a private wine tasting and custom cake with her face on it. I got a gift card to Bed Bath & Beyond. I'm not even kidding. After the BBQ, I found myself thinking about those little slights more often, letting them rise to the surface now that I'd stopped forcing them down. That's when Jared messaged me. Jared, the neighbor kid who used to play video games in our basement and eat all the popsicles from the downstairs freezer. We hadn't really stayed in touch, not in any meaningful way, but he was there at the BBQ, now a 40-year-old divorcee with a half-decent beard, and that kind of tired sarcasm that only comes from raising teenagers. He sent me a message that simply said, "Hey, that toast was weird. You good?" And just like that, I found myself replying, not out of loneliness, but because it felt strangely comforting to have one person who noticed. We met up a few nights later for drinks. Nothing fancy, just a low-light bar with stiff cocktails and no music too loud to talk over. We talked about our jobs, our families, the weirdness of getting older, and then, without prompting, he said, "You know, you could always fake your own death. Show up to your own funeral, see if they finally say your name." He laughed, a dry kind of chuckle, but I didn't. Not because I was offended, but because something about it stuck in my head like a burr on a sweater. That idea of disappearing, not dramatically, not with fireworks or Facebook posts, but slowly, intentionally, letting them feel what it's like when I'm not there to smooth the tablecloth or refill the cooler. I didn't say anything then, not even to Jared, but I remember driving home that night with my hands tight on the steering wheel and a single phrase looping in my head, like a chant I didn't know I believed until it was already lodged in me. I had a better idea. And that, as strange as it sounds, was the beginning of what would later be known, at least to me, as Operation Nobody's Daughter. It wasn't about hurting them, not yet. It was about creating a space they didn't even realize existed, the space my absence would leave behind. Because sometimes the most deafening sound isn't yelling, it's silence, the kind that echoes back everything you never wanted to admit. By the time the week rolled into its second half and the sun had baked every corner of my neighborhood into a sort of lazy stillness that matched perfectly with the quiet resolve brewing inside me, I knew that I wasn't angry in the way people usually mean when they say they're angry. I wasn't storming around slamming drawers or composing long, furious texts I'd never send. I wasn't pacing, I wasn't crying, I wasn't even venting to anyone, not Jared, not my coworkers, not even the journal I used to keep in college and sometimes opened when I needed to make sense of things. No, what I felt was colder, smoother, more deliberate than that. It was the kind of fury that doesn't shout, the kind that simply removes itself from the equation silently, effectively, and leaves others wondering where the warmth went long after it's gone. So I started erasing myself. Not dramatically, not in one sweeping gesture, but little by little, in increments small enough to be almost invisible to the untrained eye, but large enough that once they were all added together, the absence would become undeniable. I began by muting the family group chat. That chaotic swirl of weather updates, forwarded articles, and updates on Lily's conference talks or bake sale triumphs. Not out of bitterness, but because I realized, with a calm that surprised even me, that no one ever really addressed me directly in there anyway, unless it was to ask for help organizing a birthday slideshow or booking an Airbnb for some cousin's wedding. After a day or two, I exited the group completely. No announcement, no warning, just gone. Then I stopped returning calls. My mother, true to form, only called for logistical reasons, to ask if I could pick something up or help fix her printer, or review a resume for the son of her friend from yoga. And when I didn't answer, she didn't leave voicemails, just sent short texts that read, "Call when you can," or more pointedly, "Need your help." But I didn't call back. I didn't help. I just let the text sit there, unread, the way so many of my accomplishments had sat unnoticed for decades. I skipped Sunday dinner, something I hadn't done in over 5 years, even when I had the flu, even when I was so exhausted from work I could barely stay awake in the car. And when I didn't show up, I received a single message from my father, which read, simply, "Everything okay?" with no follow-up. That was the moment I realized just how easy it would be to disappear from their lives entirely without causing any real alarm, because they weren't used to reaching out from a place of genuine concern. They were used to me being there because I'd always made it my job to show up, to be the glue, the reliable one, the one who covered the cracks without anyone noticing the fractures. But this time, I wanted them to notice. I wanted them to see the hairline fractures as they widened into fault lines. I wanted them to ask questions, not because something dramatic had happened, but because something subtle had shifted. The atmosphere had changed, the equilibrium had been disrupted, and suddenly the machine that had always functioned quietly in the background was no longer doing its job. And to make sure they truly felt the shift, I took it a step further. Not vengeful, not cruel, just deliberate. I created a new email account, one with no identifying details, and began sending messages to a select group of extended family members and longtime family friends. People who were close enough to care, but far enough removed to question without knowing all the details. The messages were short, vague, almost clinical in tone. Not sure if you've noticed, but Claire's been distant lately. I heard she might be going through something. Just thought you should know. That was it. No signature, no explanations, just a nudge, a seed. I knew how they'd work. Like water on stone, carving something subtle over time. Because families like mine don't respond to direct accusations. They don't take kindly to confrontation or high drama. But what they do respond to is implication, whispers, doubt, a general unease that maybe, just maybe, they'd missed something big, something important. And the more I leaned into this erasure, the more clearly I began to see how invisible I'd already become in their world, how easy it was for me to vanish without causing any real panic. My absence didn't create a void. It revealed that the void had already been there, hidden under layers of politeness and tradition, and the carefully constructed myth that we were a close-knit family. But the turning point, the moment I knew this quiet protest was actually taking root, came at my cousin Elise's wedding 2 weeks later. I hadn't planned to attend, but Jared convinced me. Not because he thought I needed the event, but because he suspected something might happen, and he was right. Somewhere between the overly long ceremony and the awkward group photos, there was a slideshow playing in the reception hall, a montage of family gatherings and childhood memories. And I watched, drink in hand, as photo after photo cycled through, filled with smiling faces and festive moments. But somehow, almost like it had been done on purpose, there wasn't a single photo of me, not one, not from birthdays, holidays, reunions, or vacations. And I knew those photos existed because I had taken half of them myself. I glanced around the room, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to say, "Hey, where's Claire?" But no one did, except Lily. She walked over to me in the middle of the 4th or 5th glass of wine, her expression more confused than confrontational, and asked, "Did you do this?" Her voice wasn't angry, just unsettled, like she'd just noticed a room in her house was missing an entire wall. I looked at her, my sister, the golden child, the one who always stood at the center of every story, and I smiled, because by then, I knew exactly what I was doing. I wasn't burning bridges, I was turning off the lights, one by one. And soon they'd be standing in the dark, wondering why it felt so cold. There's something oddly satisfying. And I hesitate to use that word because it makes me sound cruel, or worse, vindictive, which I'm not, about watching a machine that has always run smoothly begin to sputter, not because of any outward sabotage, but because the piece it never acknowledged as essential has quietly removed itself and left the rest of the parts to figure out why things no longer click together as they used to. That machine, of course, being my family. And the sputtering? It began so subtly, so delicately, that I'm sure none of them noticed the shift at first, the way the gears began to slip and grind. Without me there to silently read between the lines, patch the emotional leaks, and play the part of mediator, ghostwriter, and behind-the-scenes project manager of every event that ever got off the ground. It started with my mother, naturally, because Janet is the kind of woman who runs her family like a non-profit organization with public image as its primary product. And when I didn't show up to Elise's baby shower the following weekend, not even with a flimsy excuse, not even with one of my usually thoughtful hand-wrapped gifts that somehow perfectly matched the nursery theme, a detail I was always somehow expected to know, she began to unravel, not in a loud theatrical way, but in whispers and pauses and lingering glances that said more than any accusation could. Jared, who'd become something of a silent observer in this little social experiment I'd unintentionally turned into a strategic campaign, told me later that she stood for almost 5 minutes just staring at the baby registry table, her hands clutched in front of her like a woman waiting to be rescued, muttering something under her breath that sounded like, "She always brings something personal. It's like she knows what people need." And the irony, of course, was that I'd always known what they needed. That had been my entire unspoken role in the family dynamic for as long as I could remember. I was the emotional infrastructure, invisible, uncredited, essential. But what happens when the infrastructure walks out? When the scaffolding decides it no longer wants to hold up a building that never thanked it for keeping the windows clean and the walls upright? That's when the cracks start to show, not just in the facade, but in the foundation itself. My father, ever the quieter participant in our family theater, began making offhanded comments, small, incomplete sentences that hinted at an awareness he wasn't yet ready to fully articulate. "I don't know where she's been," he said to Lily one afternoon, according to a mutual cousin who relayed it back to me through a tangled grapevine of secondhand conversations. "She used to call, used to show up, maybe something's going on." But he didn't ask me directly. He didn't call, he didn't write. He simply noticed my absence like one might notice the fridge light not working. Strange, inconvenient, but ultimately forgettable. It was Lily who finally broke the unspoken truce of silence. She texted again, this time longer than before, with more punctuation and fewer assumptions. "Claire," it read, "I don't know what's happening, but Mom's been acting weird. She's crying randomly, keeps talking about old photos, and won't stop asking if she said something wrong at the barbecue. She's a mess. Did you do something?" And there it was, the question again, the same one from the night of the toast, but now tinged with urgency, with something that felt like panic. Because for the first time, they weren't sure. They weren't sure what I was capable of. They weren't sure if the daughter they'd ignored for decades might finally be capable of causing damage they couldn't predict. And still, I said nothing. I didn't respond. I didn't reassure. I simply let them sit in that space of uncertainty, the very space I had occupied for most of my adult life, and figure out what it felt like to not have answers, to not be the center of someone else's emotional labor, to not be able to fix it with a quick call or a well-timed apology. But I wasn't done yet. I decided it was time to remind them, not confront them, not accuse them, but remind them of everything they'd never really seen. So I gathered a box, nothing fancy, just a standard cardboard shipping box, and filled it with photos, the kind they'd never asked for, never framed, never even seen. Because they were moments I'd lived entirely on my own. Me at my first apartment, proudly holding the keys. Me at the finish line of my first half marathon. Me and my cat on Christmas morning. A snapshot of the award I received for organizing a community education program that got statewide attention. No notes, no captions, no explanations, just images, a quiet archive of a life they had never asked about. I mailed it to them anonymously, no return address, just a plain brown package that would arrive like a ghost at their doorstep. And then I waited. Not because I wanted a dramatic reaction, but because I wanted to see what the absence of context would do, how they would interpret these fragments of a daughter they thought they knew, now presented without narrative, without apology, without the safety net of me being there to explain, soften, or joke my way through their discomfort. Jared called me 2 days later. "You started something," he said, his voice low and laced with something between admiration and concern. "Your mom's completely unraveled. Your dad doesn't know what to do with himself. It's like they suddenly realized they missed the whole plot of a movie they thought they were starring in." I said nothing at first, just let the silence stretch until it felt like a statement. Then I said, "Good." Not because I wanted to punish them, but because I wanted them to sit in it. That void, that discomfort, that realization, for as long as I had, and maybe, just maybe, learned something from it. There is something eerily liberating about stepping entirely out of a narrative you were never truly written into, especially when you finally realize that the only reason you ever kept playing your part was because someone needed to hold the structure together from behind the curtain, like the anonymous crew members in a school play who move the set between scenes and are never acknowledged in the program. And when I finally allowed myself the permission to vanish from the stage of my own family, not with a door slam or a scream, but with a calculated silence that grew louder with each day I didn't show up, didn't reply, didn't answer the emotional summons they had always assumed I would honor, it was like learning to breathe all over again, slowly, deeply, and for myself. By the 3rd week of my disappearance, I could feel the tension mounting, not just in the one-way messages from Lily, whose tone had shifted from casually concerned to vaguely frantic, but also in the scattered reports I received through Jared and a few distant relatives who didn't know they were playing a part in the unfolding theater, relaying bits and pieces of a story that was now spiraling into speculation. My mother, once the picture of composure and grace, had apparently broken down during choir practice at church, unable to finish her part in a hymn she'd sung for years without falter, and though she tried to mask it as a migraine or stress, everyone who saw her said it was different this time, that it felt like something deeper, more shaken. My father, normally the quieter fixture in our household's emotional economy, had begun to linger longer in the garage, sitting in the car even after he pulled into the driveway, sometimes with the engine running, sometimes with the radio off, staring ahead like a man trying to remember which direction he was supposed to be facing. But it wasn't until I received an envelope, thick, cream-colored, hand-addressed in my mother's handwriting, that I realized they were finally reaching the edge of what their silence could contain. Inside was a single photo, me at age 10, holding a lopsided birthday cake, the candles still lit, my face caught in mid-laugh, wearing a paper crown and surrounded by no one, because it had been one of those birthdays where everyone forgot to invite friends, and the cake was a rushed last-minute attempt to cover the oversight. On the back, in faint ink, my mother had written, "I don't know when we started getting it wrong, but I think maybe we did." There was no apology, no explanation, no Lee, just that line, trembling and incomplete. It would have been easy to crumble then, to let the carefully constructed silence dissolve into forgiveness, to pick up the phone and play the part again. The understanding daughter, the emotionally fluent adult, the reliable one. But I didn't. Instead, I did what I had always done best. I wrote. Not a letter, not a text, but an email addressed to the family group, not with anger, not with dramatic accusations, but with the same cold, deliberate clarity I had carried with me throughout this quiet exodus. Because this was not a tantrum, and it was never about revenge. It was about recognition, about finally speaking the words they had all refused to say aloud. The subject line was simple: a response. The body of the message began, "You toasted the child who made you proud. I was there, holding a tray of brownies." And then I laid it out, point by point, year by year, not in a bitter tone, but in a clinical, almost detached style. A list of absences disguised as memories, milestones left unacknowledged, and the countless ways I had molded myself into the kind of person they could rely on, only to discover that reliability had become invisibility. I told them I wasn't angry, not exactly, but that I was done performing gratitude for scraps of attention that only came when I forced them to look. I ended the email not with a threat, nor a demand, but with a sentence that I knew would lodge itself somewhere deep and uncomfortable, long after the message had been read and reread in confusion and shame. This wasn't revenge, I wrote. This was a demonstration of what happens when someone who has been consistently overlooked finally decides to stop showing up. A quiet protest, a passive revolution, and then, without a signature, I hit send. Some replied, some didn't. Lily sent a long message filled with half apologies and defenses, a confused ramble that made it clear she still didn't understand the depth of what had happened. Or maybe didn't want to, and that was fine. Jared called me later that night and asked if I felt better, if it was worth it. And I told him, honestly, I didn't know yet. Because the truth is, healing doesn't always arrive on the wings of justice. And closure doesn't always come with a clean conclusion. A week later, a package arrived at my apartment. No return address, just my name, handwritten, no card inside. I opened it slowly, expecting nothing, maybe another misguided attempt at reconciliation or some symbolic gesture designed to coax me back into the fold. But it wasn't any of those things. It was a photo album, leather-bound, heavy in my hands, filled with prints of the photos I had mailed them weeks before, not just returned, but carefully labeled, dated, and arranged chronologically. Each page had a quiet reverence to it, like someone had taken their time, sat with each image, and tried belatedly to see what had been there all along. There were no words, no explanations, no apology, just the photos, just the evidence of a life they had failed to witness, now handed back to me in silence. And I knew in that moment that it was her, my mother, because no one else would have remembered the exact year I adopted my cat, or the specific dress I wore at that conference, or the name of the little town where I rented my first apartment. She had seen, finally, too late to change anything, but maybe just in time to understand. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Or maybe it wasn't, maybe it would never be, because sometimes the question isn't whether they can change, or whether they'll ever make it right. Sometimes the only question left is whether you're still willing to be a part of the story, now that you finally learned what it feels like to write your own.